Misha here, and Peanut is now leaving. Yes. And this is German Bundesweek Part 3. And let's put a few rounds to the 36. Definitely a different feel. Alright, diving into part 3, and really where we left off with the G36, and all's well, right? We kind of left around 1999. The Bundeswehr is purchasing these in large numbers. They saw some combat in Kosovo. Very soon they'll be deployed to Afghanistan, and other nations are buying them as well. Spain, Saudi Arabia are some of the first, but definitely not the last. So all's well, right? Well, let's talk about Heckler and Koch at this point in time. Because of the G11, they ended up purchased by Royal Ordnance, which itself was a subdivision at the time of British Aerospace, later BAE Systems. And this is how they get involved in updating the L85A1 to the L85A2. Starts in the late 90s and rolls through about 2001, 2002, and they update a couple of 100,000 of the SA-80 bullpups. This is actually important for this video. Well, at least one component is. We'll get to in a little while. But I think it's kind of neat how Heckler and Koch worked with Britain. It was owned by them. And I should point out that in 2002, B Systems actually sold H&K back to Germany. Well, it was a German consortium of investors, but they were Germans. So by 2003, H&K is back in German hands. That should mean that our G36 is doing well, right? Well, for a time it is. But around 2010, 2012 for sure, you start hearing the issue that if it gets too hot, it loses accuracy, that it's a plastic rifle, that the trunnion mounting block isn't stable, that it's not effective out past 100 meters. More and more criticism starts to become heaped upon this gun between 2012 and 2015. It actually culminates in a court case in 2016. Here's the deal. It seems like it's a political grudge match. Forgotten Weapons has an excellent analysis of it, and there's always going to be outliers. There's always going to be case studies, and one little thing's happening. But for what it was, it seems fine. In fact, I found more Germans who like this gun than did not. At least, professionals. The Bundeswehr was underfunded, tight shoestrings, did not have a lot of practice firing. These aren't the U.S. Marines here. I'm not disparaging the German army. I'm just stating a fact that, yeah, they didn't get a lot of range time in, which is not directly the fault of the conscripts, of the soldiers themselves, just how the government funded it. And it seems like the G36 became the reason why in 2014, 2015, again, the defense minister and several others really were just lampooning it in the German press. It became this big political issue, and it really boiled down to military spending in general in Germany, which we're not really going to dive into. But what the German court, found out, basically in 2016, the government sued H&K saying they needed to fix the nearly 170,000 G36 is still in the Bundeswehr, and HK said, no, we don't. And the court agreed with him because HK didn't really design the G36. They tailored it to the requirements that the Bundeswehr set out way back when. The G3 was very long in the tooth by the 1990s. It was considered too expensive. It was considered too heavy, too long. And they really had a thing with its hit probability. They didn't think it was accurate enough. Really follow-up shots more than anything else, frankly. Wasn't modular enough. Certainly wasn't ambidextrous. They didn't like it. And you can see how those complaints would lead to their next gun. Of course, H&K had worked on the G11 for decades. Well, they didn't like that either. And to be fair, they really couldn't afford it after unification with East Germany. The G11 was too expensive and too radically new. And HK's other offering, the G41, was too conservative, too conventional. The G36 was the in-between. This was an evolution forward, and it met the requirements. Namely, lightweight, ambidextrous, modular. It's very easy to swap components on this gun. Better hit probability, better follow-up shots than the G3, cheaper to mass produce and maintain than the G3, cheaper to buy ammunition for than the G3, cheaper to have mags for, these unique translucent polymer mags. More compact. We have a longer barrel and a more compact length, 30 inches. This is what the Bundeswehr insisted upon. I mean, HK offered other guns, and they didn't want them, so they tailored this gun to them. So basically, if it was having troubles, hey, that's on the Bundeswehr. Now, of course, some said that testing done in the 90s was done too hastily. It was only done in European environment, not too hot. Maybe, that's hard to say. But look, if someone like Saudi Arabia adopted this, went through their own testing and trials and was okay with it, and, Spain is not exactly the coolest place in the world all year round either, it seems a little suspicious that Germany is having these issues and no one else. Now, at one time, it was thought that maybe HK changed the polymer formula, and that was to blame for the shifting block. Counter to that, and this was actually part of the Bundeswehr that released this in 2014, they said, actually, it's ammunition being used. One of the suppliers of 5.56 NATO to the German army, they were not correctly speccing out the projectiles, the jackets on them. And so this was causing burn too hot, too fast. And we've seen this. Obviously, going all the way back to the beginning of the M16, some of the early loadings weren't ideal for what was going on in 1964 Vietnam. And in Spain, suffered through it with the Set-Me-Out. No, go get wrong, the Set-Me-Out rifle was flawless. However, the ammunition was not helping things. In the end, it was probably a combination of features, but it does seem like it became much more about not giving the soldier the best tool, and became just a political axe to grind. So much, though, that future orders were suspended. Many politicians said this rifle, it had no future. I would also point out that out of the 176,000 they bought, 167,000 were still serviceable by 2017. So it's not a bad attrition rate after having been in Afghanistan for a decade. Just wanted to say that. Obviously, I like the G36. I think it was kind of unfairly blamed, but I will say I like the G36 not because I'm a fanboy because of movies or video games, can't imagine why, but because I picked one up years ago and really enjoyed how it shot and thought this is a unique, different gun. And now Fox with the Gewehr 36. Nevertheless, doesn't matter what I think or you think, Germany was pretty dead set on adopting a new service rifle. So in February of 2017, the Systemsturmgewehr Bundeswehr, the SSB program, was announced to select this rifle's replacement. And they had a pretty ambitious schedule, hoping to have these replaced by 2019, 2020. Spoiler, that's not what happened. This is actually still widely in service, even in 2020. But before we can really talk about the SSB program, which is a whole story in and of itself, we have to go back 15 years and talk about the famous or infamous HK416. Of course, this is my MR556A4. I recently saw that review on it. And this is pretty close to what we're kind of seeing in German service now. I mentioned the L85A2 program. Well, this HK steel mag is one of those dividends. Anti-tilt follower, just a nice solid construction for the late 90s, very early 21st century. Really good mag. Now, are newer mags maybe surpassing it now? Yeah, probably. This is pretty heavy mag. But this was one of HK's earliest entries into the AR-15 M4 arena. Should also mention, talking about accessories, saw us shooting with this B&T stubby grip originally, but friend of the channel donated this, an actual HK foregrip, and I believe it is pretty much the appropriate foregrip for majority of your 416s. Not a big change, but sincerely appreciate the little donation. He said he had it just laying around. A brand foregrip. But yeah, we're losing daylight. So let's head in and talk about, well, Delta, SOCOM, how this came to be, how it had absolutely nothing to do with the Bundeswehr or the whole replacement of the G36. But on the other hand, it's basically acknowledging the G36, at least its gas system, is pretty darn good. Because pretty much what they did is they took the G36 gas system, beefed it up a bit, altered it a bit to fit the AR, and slapped it on an M4. And it's really interesting how the Select Fire, the military HK416, came about. It was a very unconventional process. And on top of that, it basically wasn't meant for Europe. At the time, late 90s, this was just going into production, again in Germany. And, well, Germany had never really messed with AR-15s. Now, of course, when it comes to the early days of the 416, Larry Vickers is pretty much the authoritative source on that. The M4, adopted in 1995, was meant to be a carbine. It's right there in the name. The M16A2 was not that old. Even the A4 was just coming out. The Marines used it, and they didn't. That was meant to be the rifle. The M4 was, well, a PDW, as we think of it today. But even before the War on Terror, even before 9/11 and all that, it was already being used in ways it wasn't meant to, and to really no one's surprise, it was having deficiencies. So on top of being a new gun at the time, yeah, I know the M4 is a legacy system, but still new. Yeah, the M4 is having problems It's having reliability, durability problems, especially in automatic fire. That barrel's pretty thin. Yeah, new solutions are needed. Not to, go into too deep, but because of Delta and other special forces needs, that actually inspired HK to take this proven gas system and essentially just, in the very beginning, take Colt M4 carbines and plug it on here instead of the direct impingement. Now, I know there's an argument to be made about direct impingement's good, or internal piston if you prefer. Come again. I'm not saying they're wrong. My Colt M4A1 is one of my favorite guns. But it does have a little bit of an issue with dwell time. We saw this in Vietnam. This is why, among other reasons, the XM177 barrel was shot from 10 inches to 11.5. And a lot of operators, for all kinds of reasons, needed a short barrel, 10, 11 inches. You shorten an AR to that mark, 18, you're going to have issues, at least potentially, especially when it comes to flexibility and long-term viability, durability of the system. You don't get that with a short stroke piston, not like you would. They also can run better with sound suppressors, and with some modification, as they'll soon discover, when essentially wet, coming out of the surf over the beach. Interestingly, the original versions were just a self-regulating gas system like the G36. So the earliest prototypes seem to have come out around 2003, and the very first HK416s, yes, the name is of course a combination of M4 and M16, and there's the whole thing about Colt suing them, we're not going to get into it. In 2004, Delta Force and others soon grabbed some and were putting them in the field very quickly. And they originally offered with a 10.4 inch barrel, a 14.5 inch barrel, a 16.5, and allegedly a 20 inch barrel. It was in the catalog. I don't think anyone ever took it. And originally the barrel was pretty heavy. Not as heavy as the MR556A1, but still pretty heavy. But most of the other features were very M4. And by this point, the Marines are interested. By 2007, MARSOC is starting to use them, and you see the design just, being pushed forward. You eventually will get to the 416A3, and it would be the 416A3 that might be the one that really started to become famous in the late aughts. Is that what we're calling them now? The 2000s, the aughts. Because it would actually be this version that was adopted in a slightly modified form by Norway for their armed forces, the 416N, again a version of the 416A3. It was the very first version to at least consider an adjustable gas system, although it's not the style like we see here on the later versions. It also had a captive cotter pin for the bolt for disassembly. That's actually a really nice feature. And Norway would select this in 2008. And this is when it went from being just a special forces, small purchase gun to more widespread use. This would also be when it kind of spreads over to Europe. That's only generation 1. Since I mentioned MARSOC, just very briefly want to mention the U.S. Marines testing a version around this time that would become the M27 IAR infantry automatic rifle. They would select it in 2010 for the SAW roll, ordering about 4,750 initially to replace the M249 and even some old M240s. But not even a decade later, around 2017, the Marines would announce that we're going to give 416s to essentially everyone in a frontline infantry squad. So I'd say they liked it. What's interesting about the M27, and kind of relevant to this gun, this is the first time you see kind of large interest in the 16.5 inch barrel version. Up till now, you mostly see the 10.4 and some 14.4 5.5-inch versions, including with Norway, get selected. So, what about the Army? Well, they also started testing versions of the 416 in 2007. It's kind of a future technology assessment program, not to replace the M4, but to kind of see, is there a reason to replace it, and the 416 was there. The results of the Army test in 2008 showed that actually the XM8 was the most reliable, and the 416 and the SCAR virtually tied. The SCAR had just a handful fewer stoppages than the 416, but close enough for government work. M4 was the last place person, but reasons for that doesn't matter. Zip ahead. This version here is because of the U.S. Army. That's why I'm mentioning it. 2011, they release requirements for the individual carbine program set to either replace the M4, they might buy 500,000 rifles, or if nothing is worth buying, we're going to update the M4. It's kind of an either-or situation. And several companies submit samples. One of the interesting requirements of the IC was that it needed to pretty much be an existing system. It could be updated to meet the standards. For example, this is when HK starts really experimenting with the ambi controls. In 2012, the HK 416 would make it to Phase 2. But in the summer of 2013, the whole IC was canceled, essentially just a giant waste of taxpayer money. But HK had further updated, just as they'd done for Norway and for the Marines and everyone else, the 416. So, hey, why let that go to waste? So they put the 416A5 into production, and it would appear in the catalog by the year 2014. And that's what the MR556A4 is based on. And this is relevant because also that year, the German government type classified the 416A5 as the G38. Now, this wasn't for widespread issuance, but you do see groups like GSG9 purchase some, KSK and KSM both purchase small numbers, some federal police.
Clear.
What'd you think?
I like it. Yeah. Definitely feels good. I love that grip, that vertical grip.
Yeah, I think it helps.
Yeah.
It really does.
Plus it doesn't get as hot.
Negative.
Cool gun.
This slimline stock appears about this time, the one that Fox really doesn't care for and I really do like. Some new pistol grip styles appear. We have an enlarged trigger guard, although it doesn't really seem to be hinged. I think it's just kind of pinned in. It's replaceable, but that's about it. Still have the polymer port door, forward assist. They actually extend the rail section out a little bit in the back. It has the lengthened castle nut, which I think's a pretty neat idea. Still a full 6-position stock though. Interestingly, this ambi charging handle didn't start off with the A5. Rather, the original version here could be switched to either side, but when the French started testing this out, they wanted an just totally ambi handle. And that would be the 416F, adopted by them in 2016. The handguards do change. These, of course, are the Magpul M-locks. But the way you take them off changed. The original bolt was designed, you could use the actual bolt from the gun to take off. By this point, they just went to a larger nut. It's just a better idea. And also something I like with these handguards is that this is now a captive bolt or pin or screw or whatever. It's actually important to get this handguard off because it is free-floating for accuracy. But you also need to get to it to maintain your piston here. Very easy to pop. And here's our block. Now, with the A5, we have the adjustable gas system. It's not crazy adjustable. It's, you know, S and N. We also have a hole in the barrel here, which, you know, was on the G36. That's actually for an underbarrel grenade launcher block. One other thing I should say, because of the new regulator, how it extends out more and how it kind of blocks some of the barrel to let a suppressor go on, and just for reliability, the short barrel version goes from 10.4 to 11 inches now. They still offer a 14.5, a 16.5, and a 20-inch. I can only assume the 20-inch is just for, you know, DMR type use. Handguard goes on and is designed to hold 0. And you can really see this becoming a mature platform at this point. Around this time, they start introducing newer magazines. They started off with the metal, then they went to a Gen 2 translucent green polymer, kind of inspired by, but different from, the G36. Well, being inspired by Magpul and many, many others. HK comes up with their own modern polymer mag. And they work pretty dang well down there. Getting back to Germany, we return to their special forces, the KSK and the KSM. As I mentioned a minute ago, both did purchase the G38, as it was known, in small numbers and liked it. And then in 2017, they realized they needed a new combat long arm. You know, various reasons, the G36 is no longer suiting their needs. And, you know, being special forces, they can get whatever they want. So they began testing at the end of 2017 of what's known as the HK416A7 Magpul. Keeping off the hip, it's not bad. But still much. Yeah. Essentially, the A7 is the select fire version of the MR556A4, or vice versa. Because this was the version made especially for German special forces, especially. Namely, with this new style of selector. It's ambidextrous, and it's patterned very much on the traditions of the armed forces. Looks very much like and feels even more like that on the G36, which itself was just kind of a carryover from the G3. So by this point, Heckler & Koch is going to their H-key system, which is not M-lock and not key mod. And there's reasons for doing this, and you'll see different links. It's also with this version, you start to see the FDE or the RAL 8000 that's kind of become very famous with the 416. Now, while the KSK, KSM would begin testing in Europe at the end of 2017, in 2018 they would actually go over to the US, the Yuma Proving Grounds, to try testing these in kind of hot and dry, dusty environments because, well, the issues mentioned about the G36 and troops being in Afghanistan. When the G36 was adopted, they were just expecting a European war. Well, at this point, they realized they might be sending forces outside of Germany. We need to do something about that. So I think it's really neat that they did some 416 testing in the USA. And it obviously went well because in October, they announced that they would be selecting the 416A7, and it would be formally adopted as the Gewehr 95 with a 14.5-inch barrel, and the Gewehr 95K, G95K, with the 11-inch barrel. And an order was placed at the end of that year with deliveries to commence throughout 2019. Now, this was not a huge order. It was 1,745 pieces, to be shared between the two agencies, with the majority going to KSK. And this is right when the controversy of the G36 is at its peak, and right when the Systemsturmgewehr Bundeswehr, the SSB, had been announced. 2017, February, the SSB program is announced officially. And in April, they put out the requirements for the tender and a schedule. Now, would it surprise you to learn that they want it to be lightweight again, although maybe not quite as lightweight as the G36? And of course, they want pinpoint accuracy and a whole list of other things that are pretty stringent. I know, Germans being particular, it's a shocker. And they have a pretty stringent timetable. They want this happening. They want to begin testing and evaluation by July of that year, and that's going to run through about November of 2018. And then beginning in December of 2018, they will begin the evaluation phase. That's going to roll through April of 2019. And then in May of that year, the winner will be announced. Here's going to get the contract. And the plum is, hey, we're going to buy up to 120,000 new rifle systems. Okay, not as big as the 500,000 the U.S. might have bought, which they never did in the IC program. But still, that's a large number. As we mentioned earlier in this series, the Bundeswehr is downsizing. It had a kind of a low point of under 180,000 in 2015, but by this time they're starting to gain back. They're around 183 to 184,000, with plans to be over 200,000 soon. They plan on starting in June of 2019, kind of advanced testing, evaluation, refinement of everything, and that's going to roll through about a year. So by the summer of 2020, they plan on having the production model of the SSB ready to go, and this should give manufacturers time to set things up, negotiate prices, accessories, what have you. And the first full production rifles are meant to be delivered to the troops by September of the year 2020. That did not happen. Honestly, after seeing the requirements for the SSB and seeing how the G36 and by extension Heckler & Koch have been treated, and with other things going on, a lot of manufacturers and designers just kind of steered clear. But by 2018, we had 5 main companies. Heckler & Koch, of course, because they've been supplying since the beginning. You have Sig Sauer submitting a version of the MCX Spear. Although, of course, that would have been in 5.56 NATO, not 7.62 NATO. You had FN submitting the SCAR. Yeah, FN keeps trying with the SCAR. Again, it would have been the 5.56 version, not the 7.62 NATO version. So those would be the expected companies. But we have Steyr Rheinmetall, a combination there. Yeah, Rheinmetall's back. We talked about them in the G3 video. They're combining with Steyr to do the RS556. And then the dark horse, Haenel. Haenel, the name goes back World War II and before, but this isn't the same company. It's the name. It's actually kind of owned by the folks down in the United Arab Emirates, although, of course, they have a German office. For that matter, Sig Sauer at this point. This is Sig New Hampshire, not Switzerland, and this is when, Sig in Germany is going away anyway, but I digress. So those are the 5 entries, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. The Steyr Rheinmetall would be pulled out economically. It just couldn't do it. It folded real early on. Next to pop out was Sig Sauer with their MCX. This is around the time right after they won the M17, M18 contract in America. They were gearing up for other things. They, yet again, FN, maybe just wanted to avoid humiliation, withdraws the SCAR. So this leaves Heckler & Koch and Haenel as we kind of roll into the end part of 2018, 2019. Now, as we discussed, the Special Forces at that time adopted a version of the 416. So you'd expect that's what was in the SSB trials. Incorrect. German officials were perfectly fine to give HK a shot, and they actually, a lot of them liked the 416, and it was perfectly acceptable to buy under 1800 for Special Forces at this time. But they said, look, this is too expensive. Kind of makes me wonder if that's one reason FN withdrew the SCAR too, because the SCAR is every bit as expensive as the 416. So what Heckler & Koch did, they made a special gun, the HK-433, for these trials. And now it loosely sort of has a 416 basis. But then they essentially took a lower inspired by the G36. It was a polymer lower, complete with a folding polymer stock. But they didn't use the really cool handle. They actually used a reversible G3-ish handle looking thing, although kind of more like a Set-Miel in some ways. Yeah, it's an interesting hodgepodge. It even has a kind of a flapper mag release like the 36. So the point of the 433 was to meet the weight and accuracy requirements, not to mention being ambidextrous and modular of the trials, but at a price point closer to a G36 than a 416. It was kind of in between. Although it does seem like the 416 was kind of kept around maybe for, just comparison and evaluation. And of course, Haenel, they submitted their MK556, but no one expected them to win. And then Haenel won in 2019. Yeah, pretty much on schedule. The SSB program announced a winner, and it was the Haenel. This surprised a lot of people. And actually that year they had to reevaluate and even re-administer some of the trials. But September of 2020, this is the time they were hoping to have these fully in service. No, the German government, the Bundeswehr powers that be, reaffirmed that the Haenel MK556 was the winner of the SSB. So all's good, right? Well, you know how this goes. So yeah, switched out the HK grip for this B&T grip pod from HK Parts to see if that helps the shoe. Let's try it with this grip pod. Haenel would only have about a month to enjoy their victory. Already by October, their contract was canceled pending review. Claims had been made that they had infringed upon Heckler & Koch's patents and trademarks and or whatever else. And to be fair, it is objectively a fact that some of the designers that worked for Haenel had once worked on the HK416. Of course, all these guns, the MCX and all that too, they all have a common root. You can see this, it's not good. And that was pretty much upheld, that they were violating. And that might have been able to get worked out. But then, at really the same time, or shortly thereafter, Germany's independent authority that kind of monitored the competition and kind of fact-checked everyone, tried to keep them honest, they calculated what the MK556 would actually cost the Bundeswehr per rifle. And they concluded that Haenel could not deliver the rifles for the number of euros that they had promised per unit. Like, they had underbid the contract, basically. So it was just permanently canceled out by 2021. And this is where it gets even more interesting. 2021, you'd expect, okay, it was the 433 or MK556 that pretty much passed the testing and trials, so they'll go with the 433. They didn't. They actually went with the 416 now. I think all along this is what they wanted. By this point, they're in KSK and KSM service. There's some of the older G36s too. And HK has a slightly updated version to try to appease the Bundeswehr. The 416A8, which you could make this gun into for the most part, well, except for not having the FDE or the RAL 8000. I'm blind, I don't really care about colors. But everything else is pretty similar. The thing is, even now, we aren't 100% sure the kind of final configuration and accessories, because this was built to be a modular gun. The one thing we do know sure is that they're going with the H-key handguard, not a, M-lock, and it has the very cool and very proprietary and kind of spendy QD system to take this handguard off. It's not just QD, but it's also QD return to zero. And that's actually, as you saw, good for getting to the gas system or to, mount an underbarrel grenade launcher. Now, I just put these sights on mine. They're kind of, just knockoff HK pattern Troy types. But it does seem like the Bundeswehr is going with some pretty cool 45-degree offset Aerotech iron sights. And whereas the KSK uses an EOTech with a G33 magnifier, the Bundeswehr seems to be going with an Elcan Spectre DR 1 to 4 optic. Makes sense, you've got the 0 to 4 magnification flip, red dot irons, and this does kind of replicate the dual optic on the 36 here, although by this point most of them have switched over to rail mounted reflex sights or aim points or EOTechs, whatever they. Now what we don't know, the stock, they were kind of entertaining a version like a G28 stock with an adjustable cheek. That seems to have gone away after some testing. The pistol grip, at first it was a very vertical style, but there's been a few different reports. Safety is this style. The receiver on that's pretty. Anyway, by 2021, it looked like they were going with the A8, with the big improvement being the QD handguard, although some A7s were spotted with it as well. And of course, Haenel would countersue for everything that happened, and this would tie everything up for over a year. Nothing's happening. But in June of 2022, a German high court ruled that Haenel's countersue didn't have any merit and that the Bundeswehr could go ahead with adopting the HK 416A8, now known as the Gewehr 95A1, the G95A1. Much as how the KSK, KSM had adopted two versions, we'll get to here. The standard A1 would have a 16.5-inch barrel. That's actually one reason I like having the rifle. And the G95K-A1 carbine would have a 14-inch barrel. And I believe this is the first time, at least mass production, Heckler & Koch has done a 14-inch, not 14.5, 416. And they are mostly buying the 16-inch, not the 14, but, hey. And then in December of that year, funding was allocated to purchase almost 14,000 rifles and just over 3,000 carbines. So right at 17,000 units for, the year 2022, although, of course, they'll be delivered in 2023. And then the plan from there, between the years 2024 and 2029, HK was to deliver 20,000 G95s per year, bringing the grand total to about 118,700 and some change. So almost the 120,000 is promised, and you never know, they'll probably end up buying more. Keep in mind the G36 only started off with a purchase order of 33,000 and ended up buying 176,000. And also by this point, the Bundeswehr has grown over 200,000 men, and then of course, aggression from Russia, invasion of Ukraine, and unlocked some further military spending in 2022. Maybe that's why they're able to afford the 416. The plan was to start handing these over to troops by 2024 after kind of advanced field testing and kind of evaluating which accessories and configuration to do. Peanut time. Hi, Peanut. How we doing? We're almost done with the video. Yeah. What do you think? Yeah. Want to eat? Want to? Okay, we're almost done. Because of exact configuration and accessories, it's really hard to compare these weight-wise, but generally the 416 or G95A1 is going to weigh more than the G36. You have a nearly 19-inch barrel compared with the 16.5-inch barrel. Despite that, I would say that overall accuracy is going to be a little better on the 416. Not that the G36 is a horribly inaccurate gun, despite reports to the contrary, but the HK 416 is known for quite good accuracy. On the other hand, lengthwise, your G36 is a little longer with both stocks fully deployed, but it can be compacted down and be, noticeably shorter. Interestingly, these are both the rifle version. The carbine version of the 36 has a 12.5-inch barrel, and the carbine version of the 95A1 has a 14. And of course, 36 takes its own mags. Well, they're good. And the 416 is STANAG compatible, especially with the updated mag well. After those MRs, what do you think?
I think technology has came a long ways.
There's something oddly kind of retro fun about how that gun shoots.
Yeah, I don't know if it's just this trigger, how big it is and how clunky it is, but it is. It's a retro fill gun. Obviously, you're not probably going to be able to shoot as fast as you are with these 2.5, 4-pound triggers, but it's cool.
Given that gun's reputation for issues when it gets too hot, that's probably a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, you're probably right, but
nah, it's just
it's just fun.
It shoots different.
It's like playing a vintage video game and then jumping on a PS5. Mm-hmm. It's just cool. It shoots different. The trigger pull, the reset, the feel, kind of that roller delay in it brings you to the HK smoothness, but also.
I gotta stop you. It's a rotating bolt.
Oh well, there you go.
Yep, it's actually the exact same system as in the MR556.
Rotating bolt, but charge from here. Okay.
Yep, it's just it's got a carrier. The carrier is different, but it's actually the same short stroke gas piston and the same basic style of rotating bolt as the later MRs. That's basically what they did. They took that operating system and transplanted it into an M4.
Gotcha. Okay.
And that's where the genesis of the HK 416 is.
Well, it's interesting.
Yeah. I'm going to forgive Fox for still thinking this is a roller delay gun. Not just because, people think Heckler and Koch and that's what they go to. No, but actual ChatGPT thought so too. I forget how it came up in a chat thing, but it thought it was a roller delay blowback gun as well. So there you go. No, as light as this gun can be, it has a nice just straight back on you impulse. It's not at all flippy. Part of that is having the relatively long barrel and good balance, nice rubber recoil pad. Of course, you're not going to ever mount anything on this handguard that needs 0 because it's literally held in with a HK pin. But of course, it has just a self-regulating gas system, which can have its own issue. I would say having a suppressor setting on this is definitely a benefit, and almost everyone else agrees. I wanted to try this on the S setting, just to evaluate. Definitely felt less recoil there. Yeah, well, there you have it. If you want light recoil and you've got reasonably powerful ammo, you can get away with the S setting on this. At least I was able to. Of course, you know, there's a lot of variables there. Let's try it on the grip pod. Stable enough. Not bad at all. It's kind of nice having a bipod on this thing. But that's the Bundeswehr's latest G95A1 16.5 inch and G95KA1 14 inch. The Special Forces are still rocking their G95s, or really mostly the G95Ks now. Suppressors may or may not be used as the situation requires. Of course, they'll use standard NATO spec ammo. And for now, they're using the Elk Inspector, as I said. I still think it's a little bit to be determined exactly which forearm and maybe even which pistol grip they're going to ultimately go with. It does seem like they've decided to go with the stock without the cheek riser, maybe after they settled on the Elcan, which, you know, mounts pretty low. There was a kind of a first pilot order of 17,000. And then the first order of 20,000 was supposed to be delivered in the year 2024. Would it surprise you to learn that there were delays and postponements? So that first full batch of 20,000 won't be ready until the year 2025, so this year. And who knows if they'll make up for it by delivering extra, or if they'll push the total delivery number to the year 2030. Speaking of, by that year, the Bundeswehr is hoping to field as many as 205,000 soldiers again, so still a far cry from their Cold War days, but also a huge step up from the under 180,000 they won. But yeah, they've gone to quite a new rifle, and a very unexpected one. Something started off over 20 years ago for American Special Forces. Somehow it ended up becoming the next Bundeswehr rifle. And technically, their first AR-15 derived gun. And of course, there's lots of other features and changes I didn't mention in this video. I'm sure I'll do another video looking at the 416 in more detail, but I wanted to focus on the Bundeswehr this time. They still have over 150,000 in active service. And I have to wonder, this gun, again, was much maligned over the past decade, but once it's gone, there's a propensity with humans in general to kind of lament what was before. And I wonder, once the G95A1 comes in, if the G36 might experience a renaissance. There you have it. The Bundeswehr. They're issued rifles from 1950, well, 6 really, with the beginning of the FAL, to 2025. The idea, this is meant to be in service till at least the year 2050. And I do think it's a well enough built and tough enough and updatable enough and refurbishable enough gun that will happen. But what do you think? Well, Peanut and I greatly appreciate you checking in on Bundeswehr Week Part 3, the final one. What do you think of the G36? And what do you think of the adoption of the HK416 A7 and A8? Should they have gone with the 433? Maybe they should have stuck with the Haenel MK556. And again, earlier we put out more of a direct review of the semi-automatic and compared it to the earlier MR556A1. So check that out. I just kind of wanted to get more into the Bundeswehr history in a separate video. And we've done plenty of older videos on the G36 and the K version and whatnot. So, yeah, search the channel if you're interested. And just with the previous two videos, there has been an extended version posted earlier over on Patreon. So, if you'd like to go support us over there, you can sometimes see videos when I have time to get them up over there early. And also, more importantly, post questions, and I try to respond within the first day. With that, if you can't, Peanut understands. And so, liking, sharing, subscribing, that's great. Commenting, too, really helps on modern YouTube. But let me know what you think of this theme week. Hope it was cheesy. That was kind of the intent. But with that, hope everyone has a good weekend. And Peanut and I, we're going to go for a rest, aren't we, girl? We'll catch you very soon, sometime.